Great.
We're so happy today to be with Dr. Maysa Akbar. She's currently in New Haven. She's a thought leader and expert in racial trauma, allyship, diversity, equity, and inclusion. She's a board certified clinical psychologist and assistant clinical professor at Yale University School of Medicine. She's the CEO and founder of Integrated Wellness Group, a psychotherapy practice specializing in treating race-based trauma since 2008. And she also represents the American Psychological Association at the United Nations. Dr. Akbar is also the author of two books. Her first was Urban Trauma, A Legacy of Racism, which Emily talked about on episode 104. And her new book, which just released, is Beyond Ally, The Pursuit of Racial Justice. Welcome, Dr. Akbar.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. I am so delighted to have this conversation with you both.
And as if that introduction wasn't enough, I also got to know Dr. Akbar by attending, a Zoom convening, which we're all doing a lot of these days, via the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven. And Dr. Akbar sits on the board of the Community Foundation as well. So we are pretty sure you don't sleep.
And there's that. I might read my next book. I don't sleep.
So the convening was actually about kind of caring for mental health during the time of COVID. And I was so taken by the way that you handled the session. You were the moderator. And when I found out that you had a book, about 5 minutes after the convening was over, I had already downloaded the book and started reading it. I was very excited. And the first book is the one we're talking about, which is about urban trauma. And can you talk a little bit about how you came to write it and what the framework is that you identified in that book?
Absolutely. So, I think that my career has been built around the thought that urban trauma, and to some extent, the umbrella that's encapsulated by urban trauma, which is race-based trauma, has been, my passion from the beginning. I will very openly share that I think that as a child growing up, I experienced urban trauma in a variety of different ways, and didn't quite know what to do with all the energy that I was receiving from the world in terms of understanding who I am within this context, societal context, and within this space, and trying to create identity around that, feeling often lost, being a victim of family dysfunction and community violence, and a lot of different aspects of my upbringing that confused me, and then choosing at some point in my early adolescence that I wanted to support young children and middle-aged children and adolescents into that may be experiencing things that were similar to what I experienced, and helping them get to the other side of that. Because I did believe that there was a way for me to heal. I just didn't know how to. And the more that then I delved into the science of behavioral health, understanding behavior and the mechanisms around psychology, the more that I understood that this was a framework that I needed my community and my people to understand, so that we're not over pathologizing a accurate response to systemic and structural racism, and at the same time offering opportunities to go just from merely surviving into thriving, and that's not easy. We're seeing that now more than ever, because we have no option but to, we're a captive audience right now, and literally captive, right? Captive to our homes, captive to our space. COVID created the perfect storm that for good or for bad how bad we are in terms of race relations in this country. And so, it highlighted the work that I've been talking about for a really long time, that oftentimes people were like, yeah, okay, I know, we hear you. And then now it's like, oh, wow, this is really relevant, So that's how it sort of came into fruition. One more thing that I want to say about that is that for me, the commitment was always to making sure that I was going to use my knowledge and my life experience and everything that I had spent my professional career developing on, focused on my people, on my community, on helping them to understand and to have knowledge and to have words by which we can communicate with one another around our traumatic experiences. So that was the birth of urban trauma. And the framework captures three major components: the historical iterations of racism that have happened in this country, dating back to transatlantic and slavery and the entire establishment of enslavement, to now, with police brutality and the killing of unarmed men, post-mass incarceration and the continuation of that, and et cetera. And it looks at the biological, because we've identified that there are genetic contributors to a trauma gene that we carry that is impacted and affected by continual exposure to toxic stress. And then 3, the environmental factors that continue to show up in our lives that cause us to respond negatively and activate all of these components that are sort of co-occurring at the same time. So, and a good example of that is if I'm a person of color, or if I'm a Black male and I'm watching videos of Black unarmed men being profiled and killed, that's an environmental factor that triggers the trauma over and over and over and over again. So those 3 components are co-occurring in urban trauma. And that's what leads to then different behaviors that we manifest because they're happening all at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason this book is so important, because it also does help us understand and place what's happening today.
Yeah.
And that's a really important thing for all of us to understand who are captive audience right now and want to help be part of the solution. But being part of the solution is also understanding the problem, right? I mean, that might sound so simple, but it isn't always so simple to understand because all of us have different life experience.
Yeah, and it's understanding the problem, and it's understanding that it's also a problem that's existed for generations that we haven't been able to disrupt because we are resistant to thinking about that history plays a role in cycles repeating themselves. And when we when we say things that are dismissive, like slavery happened 400 years ago, why do we have to keep talking about this? Then we dismiss the core factors that slavery was nothing less than a very dehumanizing way to exert racism, right? And so that the core, when you unpack it, it's still anchored in racism, whether we're talking about slavery or mass incarceration. Once we unpack that, that's what we need to target, not the structures that root themselves up each time that the new iteration of racism is being developed. Because my theory is that, okay, well, we're in 2020. There are many of them that are rooting up. We're seeing it in this very divisive society that we're in right now, right? And who knows which one is going to anchor next, right? Because we haven't gotten to the root of the problem, right? Which is dismantling racism. That's the root, right? If we get there and we uproot that, now we can have a different conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been reading some articles that you've written and watched videos that you've done. And I was really struck by one story you shared about these 2 professors that you had, one who was racist and the other one who was an ally. But you talk about how her allyship was flawed because she had her own issues as a lesbian, being othered. So she did her best to try and be an ally, but she couldn't be. And during Pride Month this year, it was I've had some interesting conversations with white gays about, they want to support Black lives, of course, but they also felt like, well, what about us? We still have our stuff that we're working on, our own oppressions. And so we really wanted to ask you today to talk about how we can be allies when, we all have our different traumas and different baggage that we bring. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I certainly have my opinion about it. Many people may not share it. But I think that, again, I always ground my facts on history, right? And before our society truly understood what other groups were feeling in terms of oppression and lifted that to get equity in different spaces, whether that's in the LGBT, QI plus community, whether that's in other communities, Latinx, and other POCs. There was always a historical battle, at least in this country, that was led by African Americans, right? If you look at all the way from the freedom from enslavement, and that came at a cost, right? And it didn't come during the Emancipation Proclamation. It came much later, as we know now that Juneteenth is a thing, right? When we look at that, and when we look at the historical dehumanization aspect of the struggle of Black people in this country, and who's been at the forefront of the battle, it has been Black America. And what I say is that if we were to come together in solidarity around that agenda, that we can all benefit from the liberties and freedoms once Black lives matter, right? Mm-hmm. So if Black lives can matter, and if we can rally in solidarity, all groups that are oppressed, right? Instead of playing the oppression Olympics and who's more oppressed than another, if we can rally around making sure that if you are Black in this country, you will survive going to the grocery store. You will survive coming from a corner bodega. You will survive leaving a store or sleeping in your home or barbecuing or all the host of other scenarios that I can paint for you. And if that can happen, then we can have broader conversations about how each group can support one another. And I think that that's tough for people to think about when they have their own personal struggle. If I'm down, if I feel oppressed, if I feel like my liberties and my justice has been compromised, how can I support someone else, right? And what I say to that is that we can have equity in all spaces, but we will need the commitment to be able to come together and to say a human life, a Black life matters enough that I can put what's oppressing me aside right now to make sure that this happens. And then we can share in the agenda afterwards, right? So that's my personal feeling about that. And again, I don't know if others will share that, but that's certainly the way that I see it.
Yeah, I think it gets a lot to the lack mentality, the scarcity mentality, that there's only so much equality, as if it's some kind of pie, and everybody gets their share, when really it's a pie that we all should enjoy.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I think that that's the way that it's been. That's the narrative, right? That if you give up a little bit of what you have to give to me so that I can get ahead, it means that you're losing. Capitalism developed that in us. It ingrained it in the competitive nature of the rat race. And it's unfortunate because I think that that's anchored sort of like in the way that when we think about white supremacy and we think about what it's about, it's this idea that I am superior. I have to be ahead. I have to be better, right? And in fact, that is the antithesis to equality and equity. And so when we all get just a little bit of the pie, just a little bit ahead, we don't want to give up that position, because then we have a little bit of power. And what would it mean for us if we gave that up to help another group that perhaps is even more disenfranchised than us? In my new book, I talk about when you're an equity broker, you're prepared to give up your seat at the table. And my gosh, what a visceral reaction people have to that. Like, I have to give up my seat?
Right.
There's no way I'm going to give up my seat. I'm not giving up. You know how long it took me to get the seat,
Right.
And it is scary.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how beyond allyship works. That's how equity brokering works. You are building a bridge. You are making sure that there is movement, and that whatever is there to disrupt or disturb the possibility for justice for all people, then as an equity broker, you're making sure that you're using your power and your privilege to remove those barriers. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll give you another. I think contextualizing the examples really help, right? So I'm a light-skinned Afro-Caribbean woman, right? And if I don't have a moment where I don't acknowledge that my racial ambiguity gives me more opportunities than my darker skin, Black brothers and sisters, then I'm in a space of power that is not conducive to the collective good, right? I have to acknowledge that. I have to acknowledge that because people can't pin where I'm from, my name, my look, it likely opens doors for me. My education gives me privilege, my economic background gives me privilege. There are a number of ways that I am also privileged that is different, than others in my community. And so for me to be able to hold space for them means that sometimes I have to get out of the way. I got to get out of the way. Right. And I also have to celebrate. So as much as I'm capable of, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift the people who are doing the work. I'm going to lift others around me that I know have the potential and perhaps will not have the same access because they don't look like me, or they don't, they don't have the credentials that I have. Whatever other judgments will be made by their appearances. But if I was caught up in this idea, like, well, I was traumatized and I come from an oppressed group and I'm also a person of color, how can I have privilege?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
right?
a really interesting point.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's ignorant.
Mm-hmm.
I'm operating from a place of ignorance when I know better.
Yeah.
And if I know better, I need to do better, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what that's why I was trying to make sure, like, I answered that question from a place of, like, we all have our moments where it's like, you know what, in this one thing, I've got more privilege than you do. And if I can own that, I won't be insecure about it, and I'll get out of your way and lift you up so that you can get the message along, because if you win, I win.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Period.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And you